Lesson 2. Criminal Boundaries. First reading. Hands Across the Border. The Abortive Extradition of Solomon Mosby. This first reading deals with issues of law, borders, and in the case of the actions of the crowd, and as we will consider it in the following lessons, communal justice. David Murray's article examines in some detail a particular episode along the Upper Canadian-American border in 1837. You should note the particulars of this case. The main issue in this case involved slavery, theft, fugitivity, and crowd action. The border itself, too, is important because it enabled Solomon Mosby to escape from servitude in Kentucky. The Underground Railroad, a term, incidentally, which comes into use in the 1830s, was the metaphor for a series of secret routes used by runaway slaves in the southern American states to northern free states and to Canada. The border between the two countries also demarcates divisions in legal systems and, especially in the case of slavery itself, fundamental differences in how persons had rights under the law. Slavery was abolished within the British Empire in 1833, thus including British North America. The slave trade itself had been abolished within the British Empire in 1807. Slavery was not ended in the United States until 1865 with the 13th Amendment to the American Constitution. When considering the Mosby case, one should remember the great importance placed upon property rights and the defense of property in 19th century Canadian and American society. Slaves were property and treated as such. Owners had wide latitude in how their slaves were treated, and in many ways slaves were treated not much differently than other expensive farm animals such as cows and horses. Thus, in a sense, runaway slaves had stolen themselves, and thus slave owners wanted to reclaim their valuable property. In the Mosby case, again, it is for a supposed property crime, horse stealing, that Mosby is to be extradited back to the United States to face criminal charges. This was, of course, a calculated move on the part of Mosby's former owner, David Castleman from Kentucky. Castleman sought the extradition of Mosby back to Kentucky under the Fugitive Offenders Act, which had been passed in Upper Canada in 1833 to allow for the extradition of criminals to foreign countries such as the United States. It was wise of Castleman to try to use the horse-stealing property crime to seek the return of Mosby, rather than on the principle under which he really wanted Mosby back, because he was a runaway slave. Upper Canadian officials, and especially the public, would not be amenable to such overt arguments based upon upholding the institution of slavery. The Mosby case is interesting also because it involves crowd action and elements of communal justice. As Murray notes, this was the first race riot in Canadian history that arose from the confrontation of African Canadians with officials outside the Niagara jail, where they had assembled to prevent the extradition of Mosby back to the United States. The actions of the group, especially the large number of women, were instrumental in effecting Mosby's escape from custody. We will come back to the idea of communal justice in coming lessons, but the actions of the crowd at Niagara can be seen as a group acting on its own sense of justice, which was in opposition to that of the state. The state justice in this case meant that the rights of the American government and the property owner David Castleman were of highest importance. The crowd outside the Niagara jail obviously did not accept that the moral basis for this judicial reasoning. The Mosby case raises several important topics in the study of the history of crime and legal systems. It involved the moral views of slavery, anti-slavery, maturing relations between Upper Canada and the United States with a formal legal process of extradition, and the impact of citizen action upon events. Reading number 2. Criminal Boundaries, the Frontier and the Contours of Upper Canadian Justice, 1792 to 1840. If you cross the Canadian-U.S. border at Windsor-Detroit, it's clear that you are entering another country. Flags and signs loudly proclaim it, and the border control guards and booths enforce it. There are clearly defined and generally well understood rules and regulations. Most people's expectations are reasonable in that they expect to enter the other country if they have the requisite documentations, such as passports or visa. There are also clearly established rules and regulations covering cooperation in criminal justice matters. During the early part of the 19th century, however, this was not always the case. Many of the cases cited in Murray's study point to a more complicated situation in which the US-Canadian border hampered the administration of justice and strained relationships on either side of the border. One of the reasons that might have shaped cross-border relations between Upper Canada and the United States was recent history and the differences between the British colony and the United States. In the period immediately preceding that of Murray's study, tens of thousands of colonists who had supported the British cause during the American Revolution became political refugees in Canada. Many of these loyalist farmers, laborers, and tradespeople had taken a principled position against the Revolution in America, refused to submit to its republican institutions, and supported the British state, its tradition, and its law. Similarly, the War of 1812 between Britain and the United States further strained cross-border relations, not surprising with the invasion of U.S. troops into Upper Canada and by the fact that many Americans believed U.S. troops would be hailed as liberators by the Canadian colonists. This historical context is to point out that a troubled recent history could influence, particularly higher officials, determining the terms of criminal justice cooperation with a country with which it was recently at war, and in contrast to, it had a different criminal justice system. While borders can control the legitimate flow of persons and goods, they can also offer the opportunity for criminals to escape justice, or even for the state to expel its criminals rather than incarcerating them. Murray, therefore, examines a number of topics in which the border impacted on the Upper Canadian justice and the province's relations with the United States. Murray's first topic, extradition, is the legal process by which criminals or criminal suspects are transferred between one country and another, and is an essential part of any relationship between neighboring countries. If Canada had no extradition process with the United States, then any criminals or criminal suspects who made it across the border would be untouchable, and the United States would not be obligated or even allowed to transfer them back to Canada. In the opinion of Mr. Justice Macaulay of Upper Canada in the early 1830s, there was no legal obligation for the province to transfer fugitives to the United States, and each case had to be determined on its merits, including the evidence or degree of proof, but also the political character of the fugitive. The example of the Sandwich magistrate, Charles Eliot, points to some problems between the justice system as it was created and defined in principles established by justices and legislators, and the needs of officials on the ground, such as Eliot. The extradition question was obviously important for an official such as Eliot, who had jurisdiction in a border region of Upper Canada where the fluidity of the border could be problematic, as noted in the cases outlined by Murray. On a practical level, good relations between Eliot and his Michigan counterparts were essential for the smooth and effective administering of justice in a border region, and Macaulay's decision made work very difficult for Eliot and damaged his credibility and working relationship with these Michigan officials. Perhaps illustrating some of the tensions between Upper Canadians and Americans, Eliot seems to have been stigmatized by fellow magistrates for deigning to cooperate with the Americans. The problem was solved in 1833 by the Upper Canadian Fugitive Offenders Act, which governed extradition proceedings from 1833 to 1842. The issue of banishment showed that borders could present a solution as well as a problem for the Upper Canadian justice system. Banishment was the Upper Canadian version of transportation used in the British criminal justice system. Banishment as a form of punishment has a long history and is rooted in the principle of removing the offender from the society. It was a common form of punishment used before the rise of the modern system of penitentiaries in the 18th and 19th centuries. Banishment would rid the society or state of the criminal, in essence to become someone else's problem, and it was supported as a more humane alternative to execution. In the 1780s, Britain began transporting convicts to Australia as a form of punishment to rid society of criminals, and also to advance the interests of empire as it would begin populating the far-off continent. It was one thing for Britain to transport its criminals to Australia, its own colony, and another for Upper Canada to banish criminals to the United States, a foreign country. Murray claims that the lack of official comment by American authorities suggests that the numbers involved were not high enough to be problematic. However, the fluidity of the border also meant that criminals banished to the United States might easily return to Canada, and in this sense might not be considered a permanent solution. Regardless, banishment was replaced by imprisonment in 1842 after the opening of the Kingston Penitentiary in 1835, a new form of punishment that sought to reform the criminal for his or her return into civil society. The Canadian-U.S. border also figured prominently in the criminal issue of desertion from the army and the smuggling of goods. Since the governors of Upper Canada in this period were nearly all military officers, it is not surprising that desertion was perceived to be a serious offense and was dealt with harshly. The smuggling of goods was a serious problem because of the heavy customs duties imposed on British colonies to maintain the mercantilist system. Mercantilism was a set of policies regulating commerce designed to maximize economic benefits to Britain from its colonial possessions. Under this system, protection against foreign competitors, such as the United States, was a key feature, and often meant that daily necessities, such as tea, could not be directly imported from the United States without high duties, because monopolies were given to favored British companies. This created a climate in which supported a market for cheaper contraband goods from the United States.